Thank all of you for coming, and welcome to the Jackson Square Ventures Book Club. For those of you who've been here before, you know that our motto is Ancora Imparo, which in Italian translates to I am still learning. That phrase was uttered by Michelangelo at the very young age of 87. And it really is a testament to the fact that no matter how much you know, no matter how much wisdom you've accumulated, there's always more to do as you continue to age and the more you learn. And we'd also like to thank our partner in this, Merrill, for helping put on this event, and our sponsor for the wine back there, Silicon Valley Bank. So for those of you less familiar with the Jackson Square Ventures Book Club, what you generally see from us are books and authors that offer firsthand, very unique, authentic, vulnerable, insightful lessons. We've had prior speakers that have shared their lessons with you, like Joe Montana, Jeffrey Moore, Margaret O'Mara, Robert Kurson. It's been a fantastic ride over the course of the Jackson Square Ventures Book Club. However, when I say firsthand, today is a very different version of that. It really doesn't do justice to the story that unfolds in tonight's book, Burn Rate. So joining us tonight is Jeff Bercovici, so thank you for coming. He's the business editor for the LA Times. He's held editorial positions at Inc. magazine, Forbes, and various publications at Condé Nast. He's an accomplished author himself, and he has graciously joined us as someone with a personal connection to the topic at hand, so thank you. Our guest of honor tonight is Andy Dunn, author of The Burn Rate, Launching a Startup and Losing My Mind. He is best known as the accomplished entrepreneur behind Bonobos, and is also a successful investor, having backed iconic companies like Coinbase, Warby Parker, Turo, and many others. He's a frequent speaker at conferences and events. His work has been featured in numerous publications, and his recent highly acclaimed TED Talk will be publicly released tomorrow? Tomorrow, all right. In his book, Dunn shares his story of building a successful startup while struggling with bipolar disorder. Uncharacteristically for entrepreneurs in tech, he very openly shares the challenges of living with mental illness, the importance of seeking help, and how he found hope in recovery. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we are honored to have Andy join us for this important conversation. His story is a powerful reminder that mental illness is a real and serious issue, and more importantly, that recovery is possible. With that, please welcome Andy Dunn and Jeff Bercovici.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thanks, Victor, for the introduction. You said I do have a personal connection to the topic, and I think that, as you point out in the book, everybody pretty much has a personal connection to mental illness. I think everybody probably knows someone in their life who has had struggles.
Everybody has mental health.
Everybody has mental health, yes, that's true. They're not making any more of it. And this is for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet. It's a remarkable book. It's something that I think is a lot of people who are having struggles with mental health. It will do them a lot of good to read. I think a lot of us can think of people who it would have done them a lot of good to read. Hopefully there'll be more books like this in the future. And one thing I wanted to talk about, one thing that really jumps out at me reading it, is the role of therapy in this book. It could almost say, brought to you by therapy on the cover. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about that. How much of the insight that we're reading in this book came from your therapeutic process?
Yeah. I'll give you an example. So one of the things I had to work through in therapy was the issue at the center of a manic episode is usually a messianic delusion. And so it's very humiliating or embarrassing or whatever the word is, feel shameful to come out of a situation where for a week you lost your mind and thought you were God, basically. And even saying it still feels like awkward. And so with Dr. Z, who I refer to, my therapist I refer to in the book, who is my most expensive friend, he helped me. It took a while to realize, we're actually all born with a God delusion, because when we're infants, if we survive infancy, there was someone who was there, at least one person who took care of us and who fed us, and anytime we cried, we got food. You don't make it if you don't go through that. And then at some point we grow and realize that we're going to die. And built into the human condition is this profound fear of death, which is its own potentially stigmatized topic. And so the human psyche, whether acknowledged or not, develops a unconscious desire to live forever. Or conscious. Or, in Silicon Valley, pursued. Pursued. And this, by the way, is like all of our children's popular culture is built around the idea of like a fallen superhero who starts as an orphan, or a parent dies and then it turns out that they can do magical things, right? I mean, we don't have to go through the list, but Disney cements this narrative. And then when you grow out of Disney, Marvel is ready to just keep it rolling, right? This idea. So it took a long time for me not to feel ashamed that what was, the best week of my life, because being the Messiah is awesome, it's so fun, is the worst week of everyone else's life, because you're dealing with someone who's lost their mind, and people that have lost their mind can do bad things to themselves and others.
Yeah. One of the things that makes this book, unlike any other book I've read, is we've all read. I think probably most of us have read. The sort of founder's journey book that kind of includes some obligatory, raw honesty. But this book is honest in a way I haven't read, I haven't encountered much in books. It almost feels compulsively honest. And
Is that another diagnosis?
I'm wondering, what is behind that? You are honest in a way that I think was probably difficult for people to read.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there was something that, that made you feel you had to be that way if you were going to do this book at all.
Can I just do a poll of who's read the book? Oh, holy shit. Okay. Wow. Thank you. So
you can get specific.
There was a moment, actually. So there's a scene in the book where I put my own shit in a bag. And when my mom read that part, she said, and I remember this vividly, "Does that need to be in there?" And I asked my doctor, and he's like, "Oh, that's got to be in there, because that's like the real stuff." And he had worked in the psychiatric ward at Bellevue. And like when I put my shit in a bag and then outside by the door at Bellevue, and like the cop or whoever was there, security was like, "Come on, man." My doctor said that is just so Bellevue, like that has to be in there. And so there's kind of a moment of, if it's going to be unvarnished, where do you draw the line? And it led to an exercise for me mentally of like, well, the reason why we stop somewhere is because we're ashamed. It's like a shameful, feces is sort of a shameful topic for humans, and there's a reason why. And I think in Silver Linings Playbook, there's always like shit involved with adult psychosis, because it's like something that fascinates children, or like it's something that's okay in the toddler phase. We talk about it there for babies, but once you get to adults, it's like. So I realized if I want to expunge my own shame, then I need to go all the way with the storytelling. And that was kind of the concept behind it, is to get this shame out of my body and realize that wasn't my fault. That wasn't, something I was consciously choosing with a rational mind. And let me just put it out there so that folks who are trying to get healthy can be like, oh yeah, that was me too. I did that really shameful thing that I've been made to feel ashamed of.
Yeah.
Societally.
Maybe this is another way of saying what you just said, but I was wondering how much of it came out of this, the sort of a reaction to denial. The denial that sort of allowed you to, your family's denial to begin with, but allowed you to be untreated for such a long time.
Yeah. It's funny, I don't know what to say because I've never been with a group that's already read the book. I have to say new things. I was so angry when I finally kind of put the pieces together on what I'd been through, because I had the 16 years of denial. I just wasn't aware of how much anger had built inside me, because at some point I started to become aware, okay, I have this thing, right? I had kind of 8 asymptomatic years between the diagnosis when I was a senior in college and a year after I started Bonobos, which was a bad thing, because that lent itself to this narrative that, in fact, the diagnosis wasn't accurate. And, I guess most of you read the book, but familially, between my Indian side and my Scandinavian side, there wasn't much like engagement with the concept of mental health. Like even therapy growing up, the idea that someone was in therapy meant like there was kind of like something wrong with them. Or there was every non-psychiatric medication in the book available to us for anything. But psychiatric medication was, was a different thing. So I like internalized that this thing that I have is some form of brokenness. We can't talk about it. When the truth is that it's like hard enough with the talking about it. And so where do we put like anger? Where did I put that anger that I had towards the people who love me the most? And that was kind of the fun part of the backstory of the book. Was it led to all these conversations with my parents and my sister, some of which I only allude to, and I would in theory say that could be a good second book, but my mom said, okay, just put it all in there because once is enough, because she still carries this burden of guilt, of feeling like she missed it, she did something wrong. And ultimately where we came out as a family, and there was a process around it, was let's help other families not make that mistake. Yeah. Let's give them new information. This is 2023, not 2000. So that gap between diagnosis and acceptance is maybe 6 weeks, similar to the grieving process for a human, because it is grieving. To get a diagnosis like bipolar is like the death of your old self. It is the death of the way that you perceived yourself as a person who was free of mental illness. To accept that you have one, that you have a mental health condition, is difficult because of the identity conversation that we conflate it with.
Yeah. Well, there's always shame. There's always wishful thinking. In your case, you sort of, in a sense, you were very unlucky. There was this sort of perfect storm where it was possible to be in denial because of the weird way that you're, presented, where you had this one episode and then didn't have another, serious one for such a long time that, you were going to see practitioners who were telling you, no, it doesn't sound at all like bipolar. Yeah. I guess I'm just saying your mom should let herself off the hook.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Should we call her?
I was wondering about all those conversations you talked about with your family, because this is a uniquely hard book to write, in that the sort of a lot of the pivotal moments of it are necessarily times that you would have trouble recalling. And I'm wondering, like, how did you reconstruct that? Are you a journal keeper? Did you journal after any episodes, or how did you reconstruct? It kind of made me think of, if anybody read David Carr's book, The Night of the Gun, about his, do you know this book?
No.
About, he tried to reconstruct the years when he was addicted to heroin, and basically did it as this investigative journalistic enterprise.
Yeah.
How did you undertake that?
Yeah. Well, the manic episodes are so they're like written into my mind, certain parts of them, because it's so exciting. Like, I can't emphasize enough, you shouldn't pursue mania. But if you get there, enjoy it until it's done. Because it's just so wild, like, we're just all human beings, and then you get into this state of psychosis. It's memorable, I can remember like touching my hand to some guy in the psych ward, being like, I'm gonna heal this person. And down the hall, there's a nurse that's like, don't be doing that, and it's like, all day long, there are people like me that are in there. But at the time, if you think you're doing that, I don't know. It's like playing a video game or something. You are in your body and you think this is happening for you, but something totally different than reality is happening. So that like is inscribed. And then there are parts of it that just aren't there at all. And so the only way to access that information is to ask the people that were there. Yeah. And I didn't go back and interview anyone in the psych ward, because they'd be like, Andy who? Is what they do. But I did get to sit down. Like, I can remember one conversation during COVID with my dad. And it was hard. It still feels hard, where I, sat down with him and said, what happened when I had that breakdown on the sidewalk? And it's kind of like wedged into the book. But there could be a whole thing about reconstructing what happened. I was like, did I hit Mom? Did I push her? Why did she have a thing over her eye? And then like he had a story about it. Then I went to my mom about it, and it was like reconstructing from different angles, and talking to my doctor and who has what incentive to tell me what. And eventually it came out. They didn't want me to know that I threw my mom against the fence because I had already been through having struck my now wife, and they had seen the shame that comes setting aside the mania, which at that point I kind of was able to deal with the fact that I had this psychiatric illness but causing harm to others who I love. And so there was kind of a protecting me from that I had to get to the bottom of, and then kind of find the right way to share it in the story, because that was a really hard part of this. And I was I have to put it in. And so I remember that conversation so vividly, because I was all it was making a documentary about my life and interviewing my dad. And there were probably 4 or 5 conversations like that with my dad, and maybe 20 with my mom, and 20 with my sister, and 20 with my wife, and some with my mother-in-law, some with my friends. So those were kind of the 2 things on the mania and the psychosis side. Depression, I didn't know what to write, because depression is just, and many of you in the room by definition, empirically have experienced it. It's almost there's nothing to say. It's just horrible. And nothing happens because you're, at least for me, I was catatonic, which is why I admire, The Noonday Demon by Andrew Solomon, people that can bring words to depression. I wasn't able, and I even had my editor being can you describe the depressive episodes? And I was sure. I was in bed and I couldn't get out. Repeat for the next 6 to 12 weeks. So that part was harder to write about.
I want to talk a little bit about something I think will interest a lot of people in the room, is the, you talk in the book about the interactions between the disease and the nature of your work as a founder. It is, as you note, rates of mental illness are elevated among entrepreneurs. I guess first question, how do you understand that relationship? What do you think is going on there?
Can I speak in unpolitically correct? Got to be a little crazy to start something, right? You need a little bit of crazy, and I didn't make this joke in the book. I don't know if it's funny, but the data that came out when I saw this University of California, San Francisco study, I think this is kind of in the book, but it's 1 to 3% rate of bipolar, depending on who you talk to, which is a pretty wide range, but it comes back to, my doctor describes that as one of the most underdiagnosed illnesses and one of the most overdiagnosed, bipolar. And then in the entrepreneurial population, we think that's 11%. So it's somewhere between 3 to 10 times as high. ADHD is similar multiple. Depression is similar multiple. Substance use is similar. And then there's a bunch of stuff we haven't studied that we have to, right? Which is the autism spectrum, Asperger's, suicide. We know the data on 2 new books about Tony Hsieh that go deeper into that. We all probably know those stories. So there's just a clear over-indexing. And then you have narcissistic personality disorder, where we know the data, which is 100% of entrepreneurs, right? Because you have to have an unhealthily high level of narcissism, most likely, to believe that you, of all people, are going to go and do this thing that no one else has done before. And so it just kind of makes sense that this neurodiversity stuff over-indexes in a way that if we can own that, then if you disclose, it should be oh, cool, you've got a better shot at this, right? I felt disclosing bipolar would limit my ability to raise capital, or limit my ability to hire people, when instead it might be oh, maybe he's got a shot. He's got this thing. And whenever I share this, I also say, and it's important, you can be eminently free of a chronic mental health condition and build something amazing. So I don't want to, let's not make it romantic or something, or pretend that it's a necessary ingredient.
Yeah. I mean, it's, to the extent that you had sort of, instrumental purposes in writing this book, you could have taken the approach that, people who are going to fund companies should be aware that, having mental illness doesn't affect your ability to do the job at all. That's not the tack you took. Your tack is both that it, in some ways, made you much better at your job, and in some ways put the company at risk in spectacular ways.
Totally, yeah. I don't know if it's in the book, but like, I think all these different conditions can undergird greatness and seek to destroy it at the same time. That's kind of the deal, right? That's like Superman, back to the superheroes. Like, you get this gift, but you have this, potential that as you unwrap it, it's going to explode or something like that. And then when it comes to, since we're in the halls of a great investment firm where we back great entrepreneurs, there is chronic mental health conditions, and then there are acute mental health moments or crises, which all of us in our lives are going to face an acute mental health crisis. And we could talk about like, they're like obvious ones, but things like grief, moving, even just a new job, new family, financial stress. At some point in your life, you're going to face that. And for entrepreneurs, it's like happens a lot, even just financial stress about the business. So you can be free of a chronic mental health condition like the one that I have, and then walk into an entrepreneurial journey and experience that separately as an acute problem, either through your personal life or through the company. And the company is likely going to provide more of those. And those are going to make the job harder too. So I don't know if I did a great job of this, but my goal is to just like expand the aperture. So it's not like an us and them. Those people over there with the chronic mental health condition who we need to think of in a certain way, and the us over here who don't have a chronic mental health condition. But to look at it and say, we all are going to face something acute at some point, hopefully not chronic. And then for the conversation around founders, recognizing that the acute stuff is going to happen more frequently, or what you might describe for someone with a chronic condition like mine, there's going to be more triggers.
Yeah.
Or the highs and lows of the entrepreneurial journey are going to be amplified by the highs and lows of the mood disorder.
More triggers, and also more, opportunities, more sort of feedback loops that encourage. I mean, you talked about hypomania and how you would have these just spectacular bursts of, extended periods of being able to be incredibly effective at your job.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. And now I've got a new startup, and some people say like, why are you doing it? And it's like, I want to prove that I can do this while on medication. I don't want the narrative to be that bipolar was somehow requisite. I want to do it better. But I was on the phone with a team member of mine who was in tears about interpersonal dynamic at work today. And I said, look, it's just a company. It's just a company. And let's figure this out. Like if this isn't the right thing for you to be doing, let's figure that out. If you want to talk about this issue, let's figure that out. I didn't have that perspective the first time. It was so much more than a company. It was my identity. It was just so tied into it. And we could talk about second-time entrepreneur differences from first ones, but having it be my identity and having an untreated and unmedicated mood disorder, it made for a good book.
Well, I am curious that, one thing as a first-time entrepreneur, you are in a position of, powerlessness, not powerlessness, because, you have your agency, but, you don't have, look, you did a big startup, you had a big exit, you're able to kind of, call your shots the second time around. The first time around, you are dancing to the tune of the market, the investors, whoever, and it has long been the case in Silicon Valley that investors they love to hear a story about somebody living in his car and eating nothing but ramen and putting in 20-hour days. That is historically has been music to their ears.
Or playing Dungeons and Dragons during the meeting.
or that one. But also, those being things that if you are somebody who is trying to run a company where you are prioritizing your own mental health, your employees' mental health, you don't want people eating only ramen. You don't want people putting in 20-hour days. So I guess this is a very long way of asking the question, in the time that you've been doing this, from your first startup to your second startup, has the culture of that changed at all? Has the conventional wisdom of that changed at all? Is it still prized to have an entrepreneur who, sacrifices their health for their startup?
Such a good question. It's what I just told my team member. I said, our success is not worth your mental health. But what did I mean? is it worth someone else's then, whoever follows you? I think it's a fundamentally mentally unhealthy choice to start a company in a lot of ways. And I think it's important to own that decision, right? Because it's not a compulsory choice. It's a choice to do something that is unnatural. I think a good analogy would be having a child. You know, no one goes into the first 2 years of parenting and thinks, this is going to be good for my mental health. And you know, it's great for your long-term mental health, potentially, the meaning that comes from being a parent. But when you think about what you have to give and what you have to sacrifice of your own, let's just take sleep as a good example. It's hard to start a company and have a framework that you're going to be able to protect yourself from, if not the sleepless nights, it is a sacrifice. And then on behalf of my team members, I have the same conversation now, which is like, you don't have to do a startup. I definitely don't want you to write a book like mine. But it's just not, it's not awesome always. It takes a lot. And like, I'm here to help you find an amazing job somewhere that's not like this, because I know what those kind of environments are like, and let's figure that out. Those aren't easy conversations to have, and I don't want it to be demoralizing, but I also don't think it has to be as bad as this. You know, I think it should be within reason. And I think within reason might entail the ramen and the car, and I think like the 16-hour day, right? Like I tell folks, don't lie and say you work 100 hours a week, you don't. Yeah. But if you think it's 40 hours a week to do a startup as a founder or as a team member, it's probably not. It's probably higher. It's like 55, like if we just do the math, it's 55 or so, like at a minimum. And then it's gonna own a lot of your mind the rest of the time. And so you have to be in a place in your life where you say like, I am prepared to make that choice. I go into this with the knowledge, and be prepared to understand what those trade-offs are going to be. And I have that right now with my son, where I'm like, maybe I would sell this one earlier. None of my investors are here. But it's like, I'm gonna pick that. Like, if I'm starting to feel like it's off, I'm gonna make a move. And you're right, a lot of it comes from the privilege of the second time. Because I felt like the first time I didn't have that choice. Everything was staked on it, financially, team, ego, all of it.
But you do see currents, and I don't know what they add up to, but you do see kind of currents in startup culture now that are, whether it's people bragging about their sleep stack, or I think that there's a couple of firms that part of their proposition is that they surround founders with
getting better. I agree. I think hopefully it's going more to being like playing in the NBA. Right? Where like it's very hard, but you have to sleep. Yeah. You have to have a mental fitness regimen. You have to be conscious of that. Alcohol is a really good one, where when I was building Bonobos, it was sort of like you drink. Like I would always drink with my investors. Like there was a lot of drinking in the culture. And now it's like, I don't want to drink that much, Like I had a family event this weekend with my in-laws, so I drank a lot. But now I'll be, if I have a night where I have more than a few drinks, I tell myself I'm taking 40 days off to just prove to myself that I don't need it, and that's reasonably new. So we don't have to make it as hard as it used to be. And then I tell folks like, we need to offer ourselves reimbursement for therapy through our company's balance sheet. It's one of my favorite ones, which is like, mental health reimbursement is too low. We need to reimburse out-of-pocket expenses. As a founder, you probably need to be in therapy. It's even better than having an executive coach, which is, I don't put it in air quotes because executive coaches are amazing, but it's different than having a mental health professional. And so if you think, okay, the first 2 years of a company, out-of-pocket therapy is going to be another 150 a week. You do the math on that. It's probably like 10 grand over 2 years, if I did that right. That is a very good investment for the company, because a founder who is more interpersonally aware, who has someone who is in charge clinically of their mental health, it's just going to be a better company. And I didn't have that mindset at all.
Yeah. Going back to the extreme honesty thing. I mean, you're almost self-lacerating in this book, as far as identifying the source of kind of everything everything that went wrong, everything that was dysfunctional in the culture of Bonobos, as yourself, as I think you talk about being inconsistent. Consistency is the most important thing, and you're inconsistent, and making other people pay for your mistakes. It's to the point where I almost discount it, because I'm saying the company that was run this badly could not have succeeded the way that it did.
I overdid it a little bit, huh?
Yeah?
I mean, it's one of these, it's a tricky one where I wanted to own the stuff that I thought would be good to own and also useful for others to see owned. And then there are probably some things where I could have just like totally disparaged someone else in a way that would have been mostly or vaguely accurate. And I was like, well, that feels doubly bad. I'm in like the wrong quadrant of the 2x2. I'm not taking accountability and I'm casting aspersion. So I think the absence of that, the fact that there wasn't like a ton of self-congratulation, and I felt like the company, what we built, like kind of spoke for itself, and it spoke to the team as well. And the team knows like what they did and how challenging I was to deal with. So like, it felt weird to try to create more of a balance, and I don't know, maybe I would find a way of not being quite as self-lacerating, but somehow that became my narrative of like, just own it, put it out there, be accountable. And I recently read one of my 1-star reviews on Amazon. It's kind of like a mean tweet. And it said something like this. It was like, he isn't even bipolar. Like, Bonobos is a shit company. He's something along the lines of takes so much, he didn't say take so much ownership, but he blames everything on his bipolar. And I was like, oh, that's such an interesting way to make, in a very different way, the same point, which is like, I put such a lens on the mental health part that I think I left out that there were periods where I was actually a pretty good leader, in periods where, I had the hypomanic energy and I had my lower days, but I was more or less, I was pretty solid for meaningful periods of time, and kind of like, I don't know how to write about that. I did well for the next 4 months, and
I didn't at all get blames everything on bipolar. I did get had not yet had a lot of insights about how to lead and how to treat people that you would have later as a result of largely as a result of your self-examination process of bipolar. And it seems like
I feel like I'm in therapy now. Let's keep doing this.
I feel like it too. I wanted to ask about some other things, and I wanted to make sure everybody else has. Since so many of you have read the book, I'm guessing that you'll probably have some questions of your own. But if it's okay with you, I'll ask a couple more questions before I answer it up. Before I open it up, I wanted to ask about misconceptions of bipolar disorder. I mean, it is something that is so much in the news. In particular, we went through a month where I feel like I couldn't hear about anything other than Kanye. Yeah. And as somebody who has had experience of it in my life, I read the news, and I feel like I see it in a certain way that I wish other people would be able to read it. And I'm wondering how that feels to you. Do you, what do you think people don't understand about this disease that they would see the world differently if they did?
I have a few funny Kanye stories, but during the period of time where I came out of jail and I couldn't see my wife, so I got discharged from the psychiatric ward. For those who didn't read it, I spent a week where I couldn't see my now wife. She wasn't allowed to communicate with me due to court order as they sorted through whether the issue of violence was domestic violence or whether it had been a mental health episode. And I actually give credit to the state of New York that it sort of protects the potential victim. So it's like, all right, we heard her statement, but we don't believe you, and we're now going to do some stuff to figure it out. So that week was terrible, and because I didn't know, I was worried about so many things, but I was mostly worried about losing her. And she passed a card to my mom, and like the day of the court date, like a week later, and I opened it, and this was not, she didn't write this was an actual card at the time that you could buy, and it said, "I love you almost as much as Kanye loves himself." Which I was like, this is funny. And then it was kind of like unfunny 10 years later, right? I think we live in an age where the unchecked neurodiversity of very famous people can have a really big impact on us. And that's kind of you can skip the TED Talk tomorrow, because the basic theme of it is like, we can't lionize people to a point where the harm that they can do goes unchecked. And I don't think we necessarily all do that in general, but it's so entertaining. The neurodivergent behavior is so entertaining, however you want to describe it, that it commands like a massive amount of our attention and then is amplified by social. I mean, like Elon's a good example, right? He is on the record as having autism. You might describe, if you were not me, because I'm not, well, no doctor would do this unless they saw him, high-functioning Asperger's potentially, one of the symptoms of which is a deficit of empathy. If you have a deficit of empathy, it's not hard to lay off 3,700 people the first week you buy a company, right? But it's very newsworthy. And so if you are brilliant, and part of the source of that brilliance is a deficit of empathy, who are you accountable to, right? And for what? And we have found a way to make entrepreneurs these like modern day gods. We found a way to venerate entrepreneurs. And if it turns out that you're not caring enough for yourself to the detriment of others, I think it's bullshit. Like, so I have empathy for Kanye on one level as someone who may share a condition that I have, but it's like, what the fuck, man? Like, you gotta deal with this thing. And to the folks around you, like, they need to help you deal with it. And I happen to know some more stories about him and folks around him, and it's like, it's unfortunate that we give so much attention to people who can be doing harm. But it's sort of like our culture has produced this phenomenon, and I don't know. And we could talk about the previous president as well. Like, I live in Chicago now, so I'm more centrist than I was when I lived in New York. I actually only read opposing points of view now. I find it more interesting. I love all Americans personally, but we did have a president, set aside the policies, who had unmitigated narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, read the DSM criteria. It's like 13 out of 10. Right? We can make some good jokes about this. Like, the origin story for narcissistic personality disorder is a parent who outwardly loved you and celebrated you, but inwardly gutted you. And that's Fred Trump. And we could talk also separately about how real estate is the one asset class that you can scale assets exponentially relative to people. So it creates wealth without the accountability of having to be a great leader of others. So we could have a lot of fun with this. But what happens when you have someone with that much power who ultimately, their ego is a shell on top of a broken person? How did that happen? It happened because it was so entertaining. It was so entertaining to watch that run, and there was so much so much unearned media? I forget the word. So we've got this problem where unchecked neurodiversity, which can correlate with greatness, equals more social media views, and it's like, I'm not quite sure we've figured out how to break that.
Yeah, as someone who works in a newsroom where we have to make decisions about how to cover people, yeah. And there's this kind of interesting unspoken compromise, which is almost the worst of both worlds, where we agree that we can talk endlessly about Kanye or Trump or whatever person is having a very visible mental health episode in public. Yeah. We agree it's fine to talk about that person and talk about the things that they're doing and how they got arrested and so forth, but we don't actually talk. Up to a few years ago, I would say we didn't even mention the the mental health condition. Partly that's because we have a very understandable ethic of privacy around people's health, but it seems wildly irresponsible to talk about to say, Kanye is doing this thing, he's a Nazi, he hates Jews, he does all this stuff, yeah. And not at least mention, and by the way, all of this fits into a pattern that, sorry, that's me sounding off. But I'm curious because
keep going.
Well, I'm curious because you talk about, you have this idea of, one of your kind of recommendations you make in here is for, specifically for people running companies, is to have an ethic of disclosure. Yeah. And I'm curious what that means in practice and how you sort of balance an ethic of disclosure against an ethic of privacy.
I think it depends on the fundamental level of privacy in that person's role. So I think public figures should be held to a different standard of disclosure, potentially. The privacy thing is like wildly important for everyone. I don't know if you have the benefit of it if you're in a position of power. So what I tell people is like, if you want to make the environment at your company safe for disclosure, you have to go first as the leader, right? And I think as a CEO, it's like, it's not just like a kind of an easy thing to do in a way, because you are vested with that position that you don't necessarily have to worry exactly about being fired, right? Or how your boss is going to take it, or limiting your promotions. Like you can't get promoted anymore. I suppose you can worry, as I did, about losing the mandate to lead or not being able to raise capital, which is, why we're having this conversation. But what I tell folks is you'll find that you inspire more followership with vulnerable disclosure than you do by celebrating your greatness or being stoic. And so the pitch I make is like, don't disclose because it makes you feel good. Disclose because it'll make you a better leader. And it will create a safe space where other people can then bring their full selves to work. So I think your question is sort of, the answer depends on where you are. Yeah. And then we need to find ways for people who are in other parts of the organization who may not feel safe to bring that disclosure to other parties. And there's some great mental health companies, mental health technology companies that are offering that disclosure through external means.
Okay. I want to make sure that people in the audience who have questions, I have a few more if nobody's ready with one just yet, but yeah, let's go ahead.
I remember actually just totally it being buried, and then all of a sudden I had to share it because of this acute situation I was in with the felony and the assault charge. Like I didn't, if the book was an act of courage, that did not apply to my disclosure of the illness. My disclosure of the illness was prompted by a situation where there was no way to not share it. So however we want to describe that, my therapy session here around not being self-lacerating, it was forced upon me to disclose it. I mean, I guess in theory I could have tried, but that would have been really, really dumb. So what I learned from disclosing it was, what is an ocean of pain for us is like a passing thought for other people. Like an ocean of pain and 6 years of therapy to write a book, I could have said to you if we'd met in like 2 minutes. Could have been like, hey, I was diagnosed with bipolar when I was 20. 16 years it came raging back, and I had this terrible, and you hopefully will empathize with it, but it's not going to change your world the way that the disclosure changes mine. And so what I tell people is, nobody cares about you. And I mean that in like a nice way. I know it sounds bad. Like, nobody is obsessed with you as much as you are obsessed with yourself. It's just the nature of the human condition. And so if we're going to be, and this isn't true for like our immediate loved ones who are codependent and who have to help, and all that stuff. But for your average other person, if you have a chance to offer like a highly vulnerable disclosure, it is going to be so connecting for you and for that person in that moment. It is going to give them a safe space at some point to share their own stuff whenever is appropriate. And it's actually like only takes a few sentences to do it. I always treated disclosure of the fact that I had been diagnosed with bipolar as like some 4-hour conversation that was going to change that person's life. And instead what I got was a lot of like, oh, mood swings. So it was sort of like, people know us, and maybe there is something that you've got going on that's hidden that is going to be a major thing, but it's not as big of a deal for others. And so if we take that frame, then we can just be honest with each other. It's so much more interesting to be honest with each other, but it's hard when you're in that position, and I didn't role model that, until I had to, that disclosure. No public statement from Sequoia or Benchmark yet. I'm going to think a little bit about this. Revisions, mostly what I put, there's an afterword in the book now, in the paperback, that is about just how joyous the last year has been on this topic. and something that I would wish for everyone is that they could bring this thing forward. You know, I was at a thing recently where someone said the gift is in the wound, which I hadn't heard, and it's the title of some song. We have these wounds, and it turns out that, like, at least from my experience, like, the world was ready to take that on in a way that was the opposite of what I predicted, right? I assumed that my undoing would come from this disclosure, and I think this book and everything around it has been far more interesting than selling pants, and I'm really proud of the team that sold pants and all that. It's fun what you ask about firms and stuff, because I feel like most of my data on that comes from people that I've emailed about at the time of the book launch and saying like, hey, would you be interested in, you know, a bulk buy, or could I come through? And there's sort of this like embarrassing self-promotion that you have to do when you launch a book. I don't know. There were some people that were more intrigued by this story than others. I'm not commenting on those two firms, but no one replied from either of them. And so I'm not saying it's that, I don't know why, but there are some kind of more enlightened places, thank you, you know, Jackson Square Ventures, where that's like, they're excited, and then it seems like there's other folks who don't care. And, you know, it would be somewhat lame if I obsessed about that, but since you raised it, you got a chance to opine on it. This one is, funny enough, is embarrassing only because it's not in the book, but I was with some friends on holiday once prior to getting bipolar under control, unmedicated, all that. And one of the things that can happen for me that I recall from that era is like increased irritability or distractibility within an otherwise, like, let's call it like imperceptibly hypomanic state, which is to say, you know, hypomania includes a lot of the ingredients in being a person who's having a very energetic, positive day. And it's what we tend to expect from entrepreneurs, is that they're in this sort of magnetic zone, lots of ideas. But one of the costly parts of hypomania is increased irritability or distractibility. And so you'll get like, let's say someone sharing an idea in a meeting, the CEO is talking about it, and someone will say like, well, that's not a great idea, and it'll be like, you know, very defensive, which might be a lot of humans, by the way. But I had this intense moment of irritability and distractibility during like the dumbest thing in the world, which is we were playing the game Mafia. Do you know this game? And everyone in this situation was Spanish speaking, except me, basically. And so I ended up like swearing, and this friend of mine and his wife, it turns out like she just couldn't stand me for like the next 6 years. And I hadn't really put it together, like how like invitations tailed off on things like that. I knew it was bad because I apologized profusely to her, you know, that night, and to him, and the next day, and like I had like kind of like a thing about it. But they came to our wedding and were a very supportive part of our lives. And my friend who just shared this with me, he's like, you know, she didn't really understand or forgive you until she read the book. And it was like, oh, I don't even know what the untold stories of that, you know, like that are. So that one meant a lot to me. And I think it's an example of where, you know, at least in some instances, it did change folks' perception, deepen their empathy. Yeah, I mean, one thought is I can't do that anymore on my side. I think it's exciting that there are like frontiers of psilocybin in terms of what the potential impacts are. I think what we've seen with marijuana has been an example of that, where like, you know, we've seen like medical uses and then expanded beyond that. I'm excited about that at the same time as I have awareness of like, I don't need to alter my own, I don't need to alter stuff. And funnily enough, when I had that first manic episode was the first time my parents had heard that I'd used drugs. And one of the like refrains was more around like marijuana use. And I was speaking to my doctor about it, and he was like, you know, you're not wrong about your mom, because my mom was focused on that. And I was like, well, she blamed it on that. And he's like, you're not wrong. Like, there's people for whom marijuana is like an inducer of mania. And I happen to have a very close friend who has like a very, he has a passion for marijuana, and he has bipolar 1. And when he smokes pot, he gets excited, gets a lot of ideas. I just like want to eat nachos and sleep. And he has the opposite thing, and actually it came to be understood that he can't smoke pot because of bipolar 1. Now, is that true for everyone with bipolar 1? I don't know. There's all kinds of stuff happening out there, but I do think having a chronic condition can kind of limit the aperture of what the possibilities are. And it can also mean that some other things kind of work. And I happen to know someone's working on Burn Rate TV show, which is cool. Inspired by It's Not My Story, which is a longer discussion. It also relates back to my mom, who basically was like, I lived through it, I lived through the book, I can't do the TV show. And also the TV show is being done by someone who's so creative that they're gonna do something way more interesting than my story. And having seen like the pilot, I agree with it. One of the individuals involved with that, potential production, who knows if it'll go through, has bipolar. And ketamine is like the one thing that saved him. And so I went to my doctor and I was like, ketamine doesn't sound like the right. No, he's like, no, there's like really interesting research on that. So if that's a way of saying, cheering on the psilocybin possibilities and abstaining personally. Give you a very real-time example of it. So the previous 4 nights last week I slept well. I had kind of the 7 to 8 hour nights. I think I mentioned in the book that I am very transparent about my sleep with my doctor and wife and close family. And then the night before last, I happened to have like a 2.5 hour night. And it's not just 2.5 hours, but my REM was like 20 minutes and my deep sleep was 20 minutes. And so the question was like, why was that? It's like part of the like, why did Andy sleep so little? And my wife's answer in the WhatsApp thread was, I blame it on Succession. And I was like, I didn't even watch it. I wanted to watch it, but I went to bed because I knew I should get some sleep. What happened was, and this is like my own theory on it, but I just had a very long weekend with my in-laws and family, and I was just excited it was Monday, or effectively for me it was Monday because it meant that I could start work again. And there's this joke that I never got that parents say TGIM. Thank God it's Monday, right? And like I never got, it used to be TGIF. So I was like TGIM and really excited, but the 2.5 hour night is really problematic. So it was a whole discussion with my doctor yesterday, not long, but it was important around like what medication was I gonna take last night that wasn't gonna turn me into a total zombie today. Because if you take an antipsychotic medication to squash psychosis, it can turn you into a zombie. And I knew I had this, and I have dinner after it, which is, I knew like if I have a really short night, I don't wanna cancel on the book club. But if I'd had a sleepless night, I would have had to cancel, for example. So we had to get that medication right, and like I woke up this morning having slept 8 hours, and it was like triumph in the WhatsApp group. It was like, I got 8 hours, and you can all relax or whatever now. So it's day to day, and having come forward with this, I'll just say tomorrow's an interesting day because the TED Talk comes out, and there's some New York Times bestseller stuff that could or could not happen on the paperback, and I just have to remind myself like just another day. I've got to take increased care on those days. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, tell your doctor, thank you for getting you here in condition for a great conversation. Yeah. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you to our hosts. Yeah. And most of all, listen, thank you for writing this book.
Thanks.
It's a gift to the world. It's a really important book.
Thank you, everyone.